The support group. The first thing Margaret Bell noticed about the support group was that nobody cried anymore. Not really. There were tears, of course, but they were the quiet kind. The kind that slipped down cheeks without changing expressions. The kind people wiped away automatically, almost apologetically, as though grief had become an embarrassing habit they were trying to break. Margaret had expected something different. She had imagined sobbing, shouting, people collapsing into one another's arms, maybe anger. Instead, on the first Thursday of every month, 7 people sat in a circle beneath fluorescent lights in the basement of St. Luke's Community Center and spoke about the dead as if they were discussing weather, rain, snow, heat, death. It had been 11 months since the killings stopped. 11 months since the town of Bellwether had learned the name the newspapers gave the murderer. The Hollow Man. Nobody knew who had invented it. Some reporter claimed the killer left his victims with their mouths open, as though they'd been screaming into an empty space. Another said the name came from the police because the killer appeared to have no history, no fingerprints, no usable DNA, no witnesses who could describe a face. Just 7 dead men, 7 husbands, 7 houses, 7 different nights, and 7 widows. Margaret's husband, Daniel, had been number 6. She sat quietly during her first meeting. Her hands were folded in her lap. She wore a gray cardigan. Her wedding ring was still on her finger. Across from her, a woman named Ellen talked about finding her husband in their kitchen. He had been making coffee, Ellen said. She stared at the floor. The machine was still running. Nobody interrupted. He was on the floor beside the table. A pause. There's something cruel about that. Margaret looked at her. Ellen's hands trembled. What? The coffee, Ellen whispered. Margaret tilted her head. Ellen looked confused. The coffee was still making itself. Margaret almost smiled. Almost. Instead, she reached across the circle and touched Ellen's hand. I'm sorry. Ellen looked at her. For the first time that night, she seemed to actually see Margaret. Thank you. Margaret squeezed her fingers. It's strange, Margaret said softly. The things you remember. Ellen nodded. Yes. The little things. Yes. The things nobody else would understand. Ellen began crying. Margaret held her hand and listened. Daniel had been dead for 11 months. Margaret told everyone that she still dreamed about him. That part was true. She dreamed about him almost every night. Sometimes he was standing in the doorway. Sometimes he was sitting at the kitchen table. Sometimes he was walking toward her from the end of a long hallway. He never spoke. That was the strange part. Daniel had always been a talker, but in the dreams he never said anything. He simply looked at her, and Margaret would wake up sweating. The first meeting ended at 8:42. People gathered their coats. Someone made coffee. Someone mentioned next month's meeting. Margaret stood near the door. A man named Thomas approached her. He was the only man in the group. His wife, Rachel, had been the second victim. I haven't seen you before, he said. No. New. Yes. He nodded. I'm Thomas. Margaret. I know. She smiled politely. Of course. Thomas looked at her wedding ring. Daniel. She froze. How did you know? The newspaper. Margaret's expression changed. Thomas noticed. I'm sorry. No. She looked down at her ring. It's okay. Thomas hesitated. Daniel Bell. Yes. The 6th victim. Margaret nodded. Thomas looked away. For a moment neither spoke. Then he said something that surprised her. I remember the night they found him. Margaret looked up. Why? Thomas swallowed. Because Rachel was still alive then. Margaret said nothing. They thought they'd caught him. Who? The killer. Thomas stared toward the basement window. Someone reported seeing a man near the house. And they caught him. Margaret's eyebrows lifted. But it wasn't him. No. Thomas smiled bitterly. They let him go. Margaret watched him carefully. Do you remember what he looked like? Thomas shook his head. No. Why? Because nobody does. He picked up his coat. That's the thing that scares me. What? Thomas looked directly into Margaret's eyes. Everyone remembers the killer differently. Then he left. Margaret remained by the door. She smiled. Very slightly. At home, Margaret poured herself a glass of wine. She walked through the dark house. Daniel's photographs were still everywhere. Wedding photographs. Vacation photographs. Christmas. Birthdays. Their 20th anniversary. She stopped in front of one picture. Daniel was laughing. Margaret stared at it. Everyone remembers you differently, she whispered. She took a sip. Then she walked upstairs. In the bedroom closet, behind a row of winter coats, was a small wooden box. She unlocked it. Inside were 7 objects. A man's watch. A wedding photograph. A brass key. Cuff link. A wallet. A wedding ring. And a small silver lighter. Margaret touched each one. Slowly. Carefully. Then she removed the lighter. She turned it over. There was a tiny scratch across the bottom. She remembered making it. She remembered holding Daniel's lighter against the edge of the kitchen counter. She remembered him shouting. She remembered the knife. She remembered the blood. And she remembered how quiet the house had become afterward. Margaret closed her eyes. For a moment she was back there. Daniel was staring at her. Confused. Terrified. Why? That was what he had asked. Why? Margaret opened her eyes. She smiled. Because you wouldn't leave me alone. She closed the box. The second meeting was different. Margaret arrived early. Ellen was already there. Hi, Ellen said. Hello. Margaret sat beside her. Ellen looked exhausted. I couldn't sleep. Nightmares? No. She looked down. Memories. Margaret nodded. What kind? Ellen hesitated. The sound. What sound? His shoes. Margaret stared at her. Ellen continued. I never told anyone this. Tell me. I heard footsteps. Margaret leaned forward. Before you found him? Yes. How many? Ellen frowned. I don't know. 3. Ellen looked at her. Maybe. 4. I don't know. Margaret smiled. Sorry. No. Ellen rubbed her hands together. I keep thinking about those footsteps. Margaret's heart began beating faster. Not from fear. From interest. Why? Because they weren't coming toward the house. Margaret said nothing. They were walking away. Silence. Ellen looked around the room. I think he left through the back door. Margaret's expression remained calm. Maybe. Ellen looked at her. You don't seem surprised. I've thought about it. Why? Margaret shrugged. I've thought about everything. Ellen nodded. Then the counselor entered. Her name was Dr. Rebecca Shaw. She was a soft-spoken woman with silver hair and rectangular glasses. Let's begin. The chairs formed a circle. 7 widows. 1 widower. And Margaret. Dr. Shaw looked around. Last month we talked about guilt. Nobody spoke. This month I'd like to talk about anger. Margaret smiled. Inside something awakened. Anger. That was interesting. Ellen spoke first. I'm angry at him. Who? The killer. Dr. Shaw nodded. Why? Because he took everything. She looked toward Margaret. He took my future. Margaret felt something inside her twist. Not guilt. Something warmer. Almost pleasure. How do you feel about that anger? Dr. Shaw asked. Ellen wiped her eyes. I hate that I still think about him. Margaret spoke. Why? Because he doesn't deserve space in my head. Maybe he does, Margaret said. Everyone looked at her. She continued. Maybe thinking about him is part of understanding what happened. Dr. Shaw smiled faintly. That's an interesting perspective. Margaret shrugged. I think people want to forget things because remembering hurts. Thomas stared at her. Margaret noticed. What? Nothing. He looked away. The meeting continued, but Margaret could feel his eyes on her. She didn't like that. 3 days later, Thomas called her. She answered on the 4th ring. Hello. It's Thomas. She knew immediately. Yes. I wanted to ask you something. Okay. Did Daniel ever smoke? Margaret's heart stopped. Why? I found something. What? A photograph. Of Daniel. No. Pause. A photograph from the night my wife died. Margaret sat down. Where did you get it? It was in the police file. What does it show? A man walking behind the house. Margaret said nothing. Thomas continued. The picture is blurry. Then why are you calling me? Because the man is holding something. What? A lighter. Margaret looked toward the kitchen. Daniel's lighter was in the wooden box upstairs. Lots of people carry lighters. Not silver ones with a scratch across the bottom. Margaret couldn't breathe. Thomas whispered. Where is Daniel's lighter? Margaret closed her eyes. I don't know. You're lying. No. I think you know more than you're saying. Margaret hung up. She sat perfectly still. Then she began laughing. First softly. Then harder. She covered her mouth. The laughter became almost painful. Finally she whispered, Well. She stood. That's inconvenient. That night, someone broke into Margaret's house. At least that's what the police report would eventually say. A window was smashed. The back door was open. A lamp had been knocked over. The bedroom had been searched. But nothing was stolen. Except the wooden box. Margaret sat in the kitchen while 2 officers searched the house. One of them was Detective Aaron Cole. He had investigated all 7 murders. He looked tired. You sure you're okay? Margaret nodded. I'm fine. You were home. Yes. Did you hear anything? No. See anyone? No. Cole looked toward the broken window. Strange. What? Whoever did this knew exactly what they wanted. Margaret stared at him. What did they take? He looked at her. That's what I'm asking. Margaret lowered her eyes. Some jewelry. Anything sentimental? She hesitated. Yes. What? My husband's things. Cole watched her. What things? I don't remember. His eyes narrowed. Mrs. Bell. Margaret looked up. I'm sorry. What? You seem disappointed. Cole frowned. Disappointed? That they didn't take anything valuable. He stared at her for several seconds. Then he left. Margaret waited until she heard the front door close. Then she smiled. Thomas had taken the box. She knew it. And now she knew where he lived. Thomas lived alone in a small house outside town. Margaret watched it from across the street. She had parked beneath an oak tree. It was 1:13 in the morning. Thomas's bedroom light was still on. Margaret waited. 1:27. 1:41. 2:03. The light went out. Margaret stepped from her car. She crossed the street. She had done this before. 7 times. The first time had been difficult. By the 7th, it had become almost ceremonial. She approached the back door. Unlocked. Thomas hadn't learned. She entered. The house smelled like dust. She moved silently through the hallway. A bedroom. A bathroom. Kitchen. Living room. Then she saw it. The wooden box. Sitting on Thomas's dining table. Open. Everything was still inside. Thomas had laid the objects out in a perfect line. 7 lives. 7 souvenirs. Margaret stood behind him. I wondered when you'd figure it out. Thomas froze. He turned. His face went white. Margaret smiled. You. She nodded. Me. Thomas backed away. You killed them. Yes. Daniel. Yes. Rachel. Yes. Thomas's hands shook. Why? Margaret thought about it. Then she said, because they were cruel. Thomas stared. All of them? No. Then why? Margaret stepped closer. Because I wanted to know what it felt like. To kill someone? She shook her head. No. She touched the silver lighter. To be remembered. Thomas looked at her in horror. You joined the group. Yes. You've been sitting there. Every month. Listening. Margaret smiled. Listening is the best part. Thomas swallowed. What? You have no idea how much people tell you when they're grieving. She picked up the wedding ring. Ellen told me about the kitchen. The cuff link. Sarah told me about the blood. The wallet. Michael's wife told me he begged. She touched the watch. Rachel told me Thomas screamed. Thomas stared at her. I didn't scream. Margaret smiled. She was wrong. Thomas lunged. Margaret moved. The struggle was brief. A chair fell. Thomas struck the table. The wooden box hit the floor. Objects scattered. The silver lighter slid beneath the refrigerator. Thomas reached for the phone. Margaret caught his wrist. He screamed. She whispered into his ear. Don't worry. She smiled. You'll have something to talk about next month. Thomas did not die that night. That was the mistake Margaret made. She underestimated him. He managed to escape through the kitchen window and ran barefoot into the road. A passing truck stopped. The driver called 911. By dawn, the police had Margaret's house surrounded. Detective Cole stood at the front door. Margaret opened it wearing a robe. What happened? Cole stared at her. Where's the box? Her face changed. What box? He pulled out a photograph. The silver lighter. The 7 objects. Thomas's blood on the dining room floor. We know. Margaret looked at the photograph, then at Cole, and smiled. Do you? Cole's expression hardened. You killed 7 men. No. He blinked. What? Margaret stepped outside. She looked at the officers, then at the flashing lights, then at the growing crowd beyond the barricades. You're wrong. Cole stared at her. How? Margaret whispered. 7 men died. She looked toward the crowd. But 8 people were murdered. Cole's face went pale. Who? Margaret smiled. My husband. Daniel. No. She leaned closer. The man Daniel used to be. Cole didn't understand. Margaret continued. You think I killed him? You did. I killed a man who wasn't my husband. Cole stared. What are you talking about? Margaret laughed softly. You still don't understand. She looked at the police, at the cameras, at the reporters, at the people watching, and finally at Ellen standing behind the barricade. Margaret smiled at her. Ellen stared back, confused, terrified. Then Margaret said, That's why I joined the support group. Cole grabbed her arm. But Margaret didn't resist. She simply kept smiling. Because the truth was worse than anyone imagined. The killings hadn't been about hatred. They hadn't been about revenge. They hadn't even been about murder. They had been experiments. Margaret wanted to know how long grief could preserve a person after they were gone. She wanted to know whether memories could become more real than flesh. And she'd discovered something. They could. People remembered their dead differently. They changed them, rebuilt them, invented them, until the person who had lived became less important than the person everyone remembered. And Margaret had become addicted to that transformation. She didn't kill husbands because she hated them. She killed them because she wanted to hear what they became afterward. Every month. Every meeting. Every story. Every tear. Every whispered detail. She had collected their grief like other people collected photographs. And now she had one final problem. Thomas was alive, which meant he could tell everyone. Margaret looked at him as officers carried him from an ambulance. Their eyes met. Thomas shook his head. Margaret smiled. Then she mouthed two words. Next month. Thomas understood. His face collapsed. Because the support group was still scheduled. The first Thursday. 8 o'clock. Basement of St. Luke's. And there was still one empty chair. For weeks later, the group met again. 8 chairs. 7 people. And one empty seat. Dr. Shaw stood at the door. Thomas sat with his hands folded. Ellen sat beside him. Nobody spoke. Then the door opened. Everyone turned. A woman stepped inside. She was young. Maybe 30. She wore a black coat. Her eyes were red. She looked frightened. Dr. Shaw smiled gently. Come in. The woman nodded. She sat in the empty chair. My name is Claire. Nobody moved. Dr. Shaw sat down. What brings you here? Claire looked around the circle. Then she began to cry. My husband was killed. Thomas closed his eyes. Ellen reached for Claire's hand. And Claire whispered, By the hollow man. Thomas opened his eyes. He stared at her. Something was wrong. He knew it immediately. Claire wasn't grieving. Not really. Her tears were perfect. Her trembling was perfect. Her breathing was perfect. Everything about her grief was exactly what grief was supposed to look like. She looked at Thomas and smiled. Just once. Barely noticeable. Then she whispered, I've been looking forward to meeting all of you. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face, because he recognized the expression. He had seen it before, in the house, at the table, under the fluorescent lights, on Margaret Bell's face. The door clicked shut, and somewhere in the basement hallway, a silver lighter sparked to life. Once. Twice. Then went dark.